This happened back in August of 2024. At the time, my girlfriend Jess and I were pretty much broke. We'd spent the entire week arguing about bills and groceries, so we decided to get away for a couple of days and clear our heads. We borrowed her dad's old VW camper van and booked a cheap transit campsite just off the A1 near Retford. Calling it a campsite is probably giving it too much credit. It was basically a gravel parking lot for truckers and people passing through for the night. There was a small toilet block in the middle, tall hedges around the perimeter, and not much else. We pulled in around 8 p.m. The place was almost completely empty. The only other vehicle there was an old white Ford Transit, parked in the far corner of the lot. The first thing we noticed was that its engine was running. At the time, we didn't think much of it. We figured the driver was charging a battery or keeping something powered inside. By midnight, we'd realized we were wrong. Looking back, there were probably a few signs we should have paid more attention to. A thick cloud of diesel smoke was hanging over that side of the yard. It was a pretty warm summer night, around 17°, so there was really no reason for anyone to be sitting there idling with a heater on. I looked through our windscreen and noticed the van had these heavy, dark blue velvet curtains, completely covering the front windows. The dust on the gravel around the tires hadn't been shifted at all, meaning it had been sitting in that exact spot, running for hours. I made the dumb decision to park right in the bay next to it. Jess actually questioned it. She asked why I was parking right next to the only other vehicle in the yard, especially one making so much noise. I snapped at her a bit, which I regret now. I told her I was parking there because it was the closest spot to the water tap and the electrical hookup post, and I didn't want to carry our heavy water container across the lot in the dark. It was just lazy stubbornness on my part, because we'd been bickering in the car for hours. By 10:30 p.m., that decision was completely ruining our night. The noise was seriously starting to get to me. It wasn't even a smooth, consistent engine idle that you could eventually tune out. The engine sounded like it was struggling. Every 20 minutes or so, the revs would suddenly spike up high for a few seconds, making our whole van vibrate, almost like someone inside was stepping on the gas pedal, and then it would drop back down to that loud, shaky rattle. Jess was getting really annoyed. She was lying on the pull-out bed inside our van, staring at the ceiling, and kept telling me to go outside, knock on their door, and ask them to turn it off so she could sleep. I kept making excuses and putting it off. I told her it would probably stop soon, or that they were just charging up a battery. The truth was, I just didn't want the awkwardness of a midnight confrontation. You don't know who is living out of an old commercial van on a transit site like that. I didn't want to cause a massive scene in a pitch-black parking lot in the middle of nowhere, so I just sat on the edge of the mattress, scrolling on my phone and trying to ignore the rattling. By midnight, the whole situation started feeling deeply weird. I've done a bit of mechanics work in the past, and a normal old diesel van idling for 5 or 6 hours straight in the middle of a humid summer night should have overheated by now. It should have blown a head gasket or boiled the coolant right out of the radiator. But as I sat there listening, I noticed a really loud, heavy-duty cooling fan kicking in under the Transit's hood. It didn't sound standard at all. It sounded like a massive fan. The fan was incredibly loud, and the engine just kept running without showing any signs of stopping. Right around that time, the wind died down completely. The distant sound of traffic from the A1 faded away, and the rest of the campsite went totally dead quiet, except for that constant heavy diesel thrumming. The air inside our van felt stuffy, so I finally stepped outside onto the gravel to have a cigarette. I stood right in the dark, narrow gap between the side of our camper and the metal panel of the transit. The vibration from their engine was so intense that I could actually feel it humming through the soles of my shoes. I stood there for a couple of minutes, just watching the smoke from my cigarette drift through the beam of the campsite's single lamppost. Then, the engine's RPMs dipped down into one of those low, shaky lulls. And in that brief second of quiet, I heard a completely different sound coming from inside the side panel of the van. It was a fast, wet scratching sound. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was perfectly timed with the vibration of the engine. The moment the engine rattled harder, the scratching would speed up. The moment the engine slowed, the scratching stayed right with it. That was the exact moment I freaked out. Until then, I'd assumed the engine was just an annoyance. But standing there in the dark, listening to that scratching sound, I started wondering if it had been running for a reason. My mind immediately went to the worst-case scenarios. I thought about the human trafficking stories you see on the news all the time. People smuggled across the ports in the backs of vehicles, trapped in total darkness. Panic completely took over. I turned around, quietly opened our camper van door, grabbed Jess by her arm, and pulled her toward the front seats. I told her to get her phone out right now and dial 999. She looked at me like I was insane because I was sweating and shaking. But she could see the look on my face and started punching in the numbers. I forced myself to walk back out and step up to the driver's side window of the transit. My entire body was trembling, and my mouth felt completely dry. I wanted to let them know someone was watching. I raised my hand, my knuckles hovering barely an inch away from the glass, preparing to knock. Right before my fist touched the glass, the engine instantly cut out. It didn't sputter or die out slowly. It just stopped. The entire parking lot went dead silent. I froze on the spot, my arms still raised in the air, too terrified to move. As I stood there in the dark, the heavy blue curtain covering the driver's side door window moved just a tiny bit. A single pale, dirty finger hooked the edge of the cloth and slowly pulled it back about an inch. There was no fingernail on the finger. It was just raw, split grayish skin. I stared into the tiny gap in the curtain, expecting to see a face looking back at me. But there was nothing. It was just absolute pitch blackness inside the cab, like looking into a deep hole. Then, a massive, heavy thud slammed against the metal bottom of the van, right by my feet. It was a wet, heavy impact, so violent that it actually made the rusted metal of the outer panel flex outward. I completely lost it. I ran back to our camper, threw myself into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sped out of that gravel yard so fast the tires were screaming and throwing stones into the dark hedges. We didn't even pack up our campsite gear. We just drove right through our electrical hookup cable, snapping it clean off the post. We met the police at a petrol station about 10 miles down the road, and 2 patrol cars escorted us back to the site about 45 minutes later. When we pulled back into the lot, the corner pitch was completely empty. The transit was entirely gone. But the weirdest part was the ground. In the short time it took us to leave and return with the police, someone had actually taken a heavy rake and meticulously smoothed over the entire gravel bay where the van had been sitting. Every single tire track, every footprint, and any potential fluid leaks had been completely scrubbed away. There wasn't a single shred of evidence left behind. The officers spent about an hour taking our statements. They walked the perimeter of the campsite several times with flashlights, stopping occasionally to examine the gravel where the transit had been parked. Every now and then they'd exchange a look or quietly say something to each other that I couldn't hear. Eventually they told us there wasn't much more they could do that night and advised us to find somewhere else to stay. As we were leaving, I looked back toward the empty corner of the campsite. But I haven't been able to sleep properly since that night. I keep lying awake in the dark, replaying the timeline over and over in my head. I keep wondering what would have happened if I'd actually knocked on that window a second earlier, or what would have happened if I'd stayed there for just one more minute. Maybe there was someone locked in the back of that van, struggling to get out while the driver used the engine to muffle the noise. But the rusted metal underside of the Transit was barely 4 inches off the gravel. There was physically no space beneath that floorboard for a human being to be crawling around. And that final heavy thud didn't come from inside the van. The metal floor plate buckled upward, away from the road. Whatever made that scratching sound, and whatever slammed its weight against the metal right next to my shoes, wasn't inside the vehicle. It was underneath it, down in the dirt. And I can't stop thinking that the person inside that van wasn't running the engine to hide a crime from the outside world. They were running it so they didn't have to hear what was clawing at the floor beneath their feet. Whatever was under that van may have never been found. And honestly, I don't think I want it to be.